It's a delight for me to host this panel because all three of these gentlemen I consider very good friends. And I probably shouldn't rely on any note cards, so I'll just keep one close. But Gabriel Calzada, is this the order we're going in? What order should we go in? Roger first? Okay. First, very fittingly, will be the Honorable Roger Helmer, a member of the European Parliament from the East Midlands. He's a member of the Tory party. And actually, to the great consternation of his colleagues, brings a lifetime of experience in the real world to his legislating, which causes no end of difficulty, particularly, as you know, if you have access to YouTube. He's had some wonderful moments, and I suggest you check them out. He's on the temporary another one of these temporary committees, a temporary committee on climate change in the European Parliament, with which he's had great fun. And then second will be Professor Benny Pizer, a social anthropologist at Liverpool John Moores University, who was announced on national television the other day as hosting this conference, by the way. You may have heard of him and his elevation. Benny distributes the CCNet, the invaluable CCNet update on the science and the politics and the policies related to climate change, as well as near-Earth objects and other related matters, to about 6,500 relevant recipients, be they IPCC members, governmental representatives, policy wonks, you name it. And it's a wonderful way to keep up with the issues. And again, he's a social anthropologist who has turned his gimlet eye on the panic of catastrophic man-made global warming, which of course is a very, very fertile field for his academic pursuit. And then last but certainly not least is Professor Gabriel Calzada, who is the founder and president of the Instituto Juan de Mariana, a classical liberal or free market think tank in Madrid, an absolute star, a man of great courage, who for a while was one of the very, very few voices in Spain fighting out, now a media star, both print, king of all media, I'd say, broadcast and print, including in very hostile fora, as I recall. But he's also a professor of economics at King Juan Carlos University and has kindly hosted me in Spain on several occasions. And he will address issues related to the green jobs miracle. Is there an unseen? When you create a green job, are you killing jobs elsewhere in the economy? And the other members will talk about the emissions trading scheme. For example, we're told up on Capitol Hill, oh, don't worry, we'll just avoid Europe's problems. Details to follow. And I'm just curious, I'd like to hear from the panel, should our members of Congress let you Europeans in on their secret of how to cure your problems?
We'd like to
or
know.
do you know? Okay, because so far as I can tell, it's in a lockbox somewhere. So, Roger, if you speak first.
Well, Chris, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a huge pleasure for me to be here in New York. I seem to get across to the States about a couple of times a year. I need to do that to keep sane. But somehow or another, I haven't been in New York for, it must be literally 3 decades. So it's a huge pleasure to be back. And I'd like to thank the Heartland Institute for setting this thing up. It's been a great conference so far. I've had a great time. I'm sure you're having a great time. And before I get into the meat of the subject, there are just a couple of little items that caught my eye as we were going through the earlier sessions. One of them from our chairman, Chris Horner, because this morning, Chris, I think you were telling us in some detail about the way that the Democrats in the US are taking an international treaty and saying, well, hell, this isn't really a treaty, this is an executive agreement. And that struck a chord with me because, of course, in Europe, we've got the reverse situation. We've got something called the European Constitution that took them about 2 years to cook up and is about 30 times longer than the American Constitution and about 30 times less comprehensible. And they were amazed when the French and the Dutch had a referendum in 2005 and voted it down. So what did they do? They spent 2 years thinking about it, and they came back with a new document called the Treaty of Lisbon. And I can tell you that the Treaty of Lisbon is functionally identical to the Constitution. So while your friends on Capitol Hill are trying to convince you that a treaty isn't really a treaty, our friends in Brussels are trying to convince us that a Constitution really is a treaty. I was also struck by Myron Ebell's comments about opposing cap and trade and why we should all go around asking our politicians, why do you want to raise the price of my energy? And that is very close to my heart, and indeed very close to the subject I want to be talking about this afternoon, and I just hope I'm going to give you a little bit more ammunition in fighting this whole cap and trade concept. I'd like to make a couple of points before I start. The first thing is, a lot of the material I will use, I've plagiarized. In politics, plagiarism is the best thing. You very rarely have new ideas. But a lot of the stuff I've used a think tank in London called Open Europe. I recommend them, www.openeurope.org. They've done 3 excellent reports on this whole area. And I thought I had all 3 with me, but I only seem to have 2. One of them is called The Price of Hot Air. One of them is called Europe's Dirty Secret, Why the EU Emissions Trading Scheme Isn't Working. And most recently, October 2008, a report called The EU Climate Action and Renewable Energy Package, Are We About to Be Locked into the Wrong Policy? And the answer to that question, as I hope I will convince you, is yes, we are. Now, the other point I would like to make, and it's a point made by somebody earlier on today, I appreciate that there will not be many people in this room who buy into climate alarmism. But I'd like to move beyond that, and I'm answering a different question. I'm not saying, do we believe in climate alarmism, because I know what the answer is. I'm saying, okay, let's assume for the moment, let's give the other side the credit. Let's say they're absolutely right, the IPCC is absolutely right. Let's say climate alarmism is entirely justified, and the world is facing catastrophic warming because of human emissions of CO2. Absolute nonsense, I know, but let's make that as a working assumption, and then ask the question, if we accept that, is cap and trade the best response? I think that's the best way to approach it. Now, in the European Union, we have this new measure, and it's one of the most substantial pieces of legislation I think I've seen in my 10 years in the Parliament, and it's called the Climate and Energy Package, and it contains some very, very optimistic, some people would say heroic, objectives. First of all, by the year 2020, they want to obtain 20% of Europe's energy requirements from renewables. And I stress that is Europe's total energy requirements. It isn't just electricity generation. But the fact is, most of their renewables going into the energy mix will in fact be through electricity generation. So instead of talking about a mere 20%, by the time you're talking about electricity generation, you're talking anything from 35 to 40% to come from renewables. And in many European countries, although they talk about half a dozen different renewable technologies, the only one that they think is going to deliver any serious volume at all is wind power. And that is why we are seeing wind farms and planning applications for wind farms breaking out like a rash across the UK. And I may say breaking out like a rash particularly in the East Midlands, which I represent, in the what we call the M1A14 corridor because of the roads that are involved. And I've got to tell you that I do have a personal interest in this matter because there is currently a planning application for 10 wind turbines within a mile of my home, and I got to tell you I am not very keen on that prospect at all. In addition, the EU is proposing that 10% of transport fuel should come from biofuels. Now, this target is locked into the system, and many people in Europe, as elsewhere, are having second thoughts and reservations about whether biofuels are really quite that smart. Do they, in fact, save the carbon emissions that they are alleged to save? Probably not. Do they, in fact, affect the price of food and reduce the supply of food and make us less secure in our food supplies? Many people are becoming concerned about that. Indeed, one of our government ministers in the UK was asked about these questions. Didn't she agree that, in fact, times had changed and maybe biofuels weren't such a smart idea? Well, she said, that may be, but we will lose our credibility and influence in this area of European Union policy if we try and reopen it. And besides, if we reopen one element of the package, other people will seek to reopen other areas, and then it will all fall apart. What a good thing, I thought. But the biggest thing in this whole package, probably, is the updating of the European emissions trading system. And that's a long and tedious phrase. We call it the ETS. So if I can call it the ETS, that will be helpful. I appreciate that this side of the water you tend to call it cap and trade. The effects of this new proposal and the phase 2 of the ETS will be lower overall limits and more central control from Brussels. At the moment, the member states have they're on a pretty long leash about how they handle these various reductions, how they allocate permits and all those things. We're going to see, as usual in Europe, we're going to see more central control. That's what it's all about, by the way, the European Union. More central control could be the motto. At the moment, the ETS scheme covers around 40% of the EU total emissions, because of course it only applies to certain industries and only to large operators in those industries. And in the second phase up to 2020, well, second and third phases up to 2020, they're looking for a 21% reduction in emissions from that 40% of the economy, but they also have a target for the other 60% of the economy because they want member states to take responsibility for reducing emissions there by 10%. So these are substantial reductions. We then come to the costs. Now, Open Europe have made an estimate that the costs across the EU, the annual costs, by 2020 will be 73 billion euros a year. And for those of you not too familiar with euros, that's broadly speaking, rough terms, about $100 billion, which by anybody's estimate is quite a lot of money. And I have to tell you that the Commission's estimate is pretty much the same as that. So it isn't a case of a skeptical think tank going out on a limb. That is more or less a sort of agreed figure. And even that excludes some of the costs. For example, renewable energy will require massive investment in the electricity distribution grid in order to plug it in. That isn't taken into account. And I understand that the estimate does take into account considerable increases in the efficiency of renewables, including wind. That would be nice, wouldn't it? But it's very clear that if those efficiencies are not achieved, then things will be even worse. The cost for the UK is going to come in at about £9 billion a year, or about 13 billion US dollars by 2020, which is, as you must appreciate, perhaps something to look forward to. The effect of this as well, in the UK at least, is estimated to push a further 1 million people into fuel poverty. Now, I don't know whether the concept of fuel poverty is familiar this side of the water, but we have a definition in the UK at least that people are in fuel poverty if they need to spend more than 10% of their family income on heating their homes and on energy for their homes. And the estimate is that these measures, by increasing the price of electricity, probably by the order of £200, say $300 per average household, will force a further 1 million people into fuel poverty, which I suppose is something that they will not look forward to. Now, the effect of the emissions trading scheme, it has been fraught with, and here I come to one of my favorite phrases in politics because it comes up so often, especially in Brussels, we come up with unintended consequences and perverse incentives. You could say that was a motto for Brussels as well. You start out with a bunch of bureaucrats who set the rules. What they're going to do, first of all, is choose the industries that they regard as energy-intensive industries. So they decide which industries are going to be in and which industries are going to be out. When they've done that, they're obviously going to set for each of those industries, they're going to set a cut-off point for the size of the business. So if you're a bit bigger than that cut-off point, then you're involved in emissions trading. But if you're a tiddler at the bottom of the pile, then of course you're not involved. Now, unfortunately, in the real world, businesses are not wholly divided into very large companies on the one hand and tiddlers on the other. There are, in fact, companies in a wide range of sizes, and we'll come to that in a moment. The bureaucrats then allocate free permits. I understand that over here you're not planning to do that, which is probably smart, but they allocate free permits as sort of grandfather rights to companies that are already using large amounts of electricity, so as to cushion the shock and give people a little while to feel their way in. Now, what does this do? If you're going to existing large operators and giving them a free allocation of emissions permits, what you've done is you've created a massive barrier to new entrants into that market. And if you have any market where you effectively protect the established players at the expense of potential new entrants, what you are doing is you are stifling competition and stifling innovation. But I may say that could well be a motto for Brussels as well. Now, consider that cutoff point that I mentioned. Imagine you have two, I don't know, cement companies 3 miles down the road from each other, which is not an unusual situation because they may be drawing on the same quarry for their raw materials. Imagine one is 5% smaller than the cutoff level and one is 5% bigger than the cutoff level. And then consider how the larger one, which is engaged in this scheme, is ever going to compete with the smaller one. It is going to be extremely difficult. Then again, the initial allocation depends upon previous consumption. If you consider that there is an issue here again of grandfather rights, imagine two more companies side by side, equivalent in almost every respect except one. The management of one company has invested heavily in energy efficiency and is now extremely efficient. The management of the other company never bothered. So under this new system, you're going to have the dirty company, the company that failed to be environmental, being rewarded with large issues of free permits, whereas the company that was responsible and environmentally friendly is punished. They recognize this problem, and there is talk of using industry standards and best practice for emissions rather than the actual historical record. Can you imagine what a field day that will create for lobbyists as they mill round Brussels in their thousands, trying to persuade the bureaucrats just to set the limits and the terms so that they will favor their particular operation and not their competitor? It creates huge distortions in the market. I was talking to some people today who are major customers of the cement industry, and they think there's a cartel operating in the cement industry. I myself couldn't possibly comment. But the cement industry, given the current downturn, finds itself actually producing rather less cement than it might have anticipated. As a result, it's got excess allowances. So it's got a compensation there for the recession because it's got a lot of emissions permits, surplus to requirements, that it can sell on in the market. Admittedly, the price is not that good, but at least it's an extra income stream. So if you're a cement manufacturer, and if you do have some informal understanding with your competitors about the way the market should be managed, you have a double incentive to reduce production. First of all, to give you more permits to sell, and second of all, if you keep the total production in the market down, then you help to keep the prices up. So it's good all round, really, isn't it? It'll work very well for them. You can see why there are people in industry who are not too distressed by this arrangement. Then again, the European Union is subsidizing particular technologies. It's making rules for biofuel. It's in favor of wind, and many member states are deliberately subsidizing wind. In fact, they have to subsidize wind because, as we all know, there is nobody in the world would dream of building a wind farm if it were not subsidized. Now, making the assumption I put to you to start with that we want to reduce CO2 emissions, the best way to do so is to be totally technology neutral and let the market respond by pursuing the lowest cost options. Good heavens, 5 minutes? I've hardly got into the start of this here. Okay, I will therefore abbreviate. Lowest cost options. If you're going to reduce CO2 emissions, you want to do it in the cheapest way. You want to go for the low-hanging fruit. You do not want to specify or have government specify expensive ways of doing it. That is the danger. The other thing that goes with this whole program is the trade barriers, because if you're going to impose these burdens on your business, on your industry, then clearly you're at risk of competition from overseas. Imagine the problems we're going to have with the WTO when we start putting green tariffs on imports. The whole emissions trading thing goes on one stage further with the Clean Development Mechanism, which is a deal under which you can actually buy emissions permits from third countries outside the EU, like Russia or China or India, on the basis of certificates from them saying that they have a project to reduce their emissions. Well, would you accept a safety certificate on a bottle of Chinese baby milk? I don't think I would, and I wouldn't accept a certificate from some obscure place in China saying that some company had reduced its emissions. It is simply, we are opening our wallets and inviting crooked entrepreneurs in third countries to take our money. What was the effect of the emissions trading scheme? It resulted in transfers of very large sums of money, about £500 million a year, from the UK to continental countries, because our government was parsimonious in handing out permits, whereas they were not. There was actually some transferring of money, in effect, from hospitals to oil companies, because the oil companies knew how to play the game and the hospitals didn't. I don't think that was an intended consequence. In terms of price, The price collapsed. The estimated social environmental cost, if you believe in that, of a ton of CO2 is about 20 to 40 euros. The market price, in fact, collapsed to zero. It's currently below 10 euros. The cost of the EU's program is estimated at between 80 and 100 euros a ton. It is really extraordinarily volatile. It is not a good basis for planning. Now, personally, as a conservative, I absolutely hate tax, and I hate being in a position to recommend a tax, but if you really want a logical disincentive to carbon emissions, you should have a carbon tax, not emissions trading, because it's inclusive, it's transparent, it's predictable, and it is non-discriminatory between different technologies. And I will therefore close with an appeal to all of you as Americans. I'm excluding now those who aren't Americans. Unfortunately, on this trip, I don't have a meeting scheduled with President Obama, but if I did, I would go to him and I would tell him the experience we've had in Europe, and I would say, for heaven's sake, don't do it here. Don't make the same mistake. There was one of your American journalists who went to the Soviet Union, I think in the 20s. His name was Joseph Lincoln Steffens, and he famously came back and said, "I have seen the future and it works." Well, he was wrong, and the European Commission is wrong. I have seen the future of emissions trading, and believe me, it does not work.